Hi, this is James Page at Connected Britain 2025. We found a little bit of time to come away from the main part of the conference to talk to Francisco DeCarvalho, who is a member of the governing body of LF Broadband. Terrific to talk to you. Thank you for coming and having a chat.
My pleasure.
Firstly, for the uninitiated, for those who should know already but maybe don't, maybe give us a little bit of background on who LF Broadband is, who your members are, and what the sort of services are that you do.
Yeah, of course. So Linux Foundation is an open source organization. Most people will know about Red Hat Linux. So Linux is open source. Linux Foundation is a body that encompasses all of the open source projects that you kind of care to mention also. It's a great community of like-minded people. They develop open source, they get it supported, they deliver it out there. The Linux Foundation Broadband is a mature project that came out of the Open Networking Foundation. And the Open Networking Foundation, it was a substantial organization breaking barriers, looking at disaggregation of hardware and software solutions. Started off with broadband, but also expanded to the chipset, vendor lock, and a number of other projects which we don't need to go into. And Linux Foundation Broadband had two very specific assets. One is the CBA reference design, software-enabled broadband access. And out of the CBA reference design came a very specific solution, which is Volta, virtual OLT hardware abstraction. What does that do? That breaks the vendor lock. Okay. It basically means that you, as a hardware OEM supplier, do not have to develop your own software. You can, off the shelf, pick up the Volta software, install it, integrate it into your hardware, and you have a solution that is compliant to multiple management platforms, if you like. There's a defined API, there's an agent that runs an OLT, and there's an adapter that either can be the default adapter, that's critical. The Linux Foundation Broadband Volta adapter is standards-based, and it allows you to not have to do anything, basically, to integrate into a third-party platform. If you so wish to develop your own, well, you can. That's not a problem. And you would do that for your own management and control platform.
Okay.
But that's who we are, and we're out there basically to grow broadband and open the ecosystem so that it goes beyond the tier one provider-only environment.
Well, let's talk in a minute about maybe some practical examples or giving us of how that actually works. But I think you mentioned interoperability and the importance of that. So maybe it'd be helpful to talk a little bit more about how the integration of different hardware into one solution is really important.
Yeah, so the reason that Volta adds value to the ecosystem is that it has an open API that is defined, is documented, and there's software that you can literally download and install it and get some help to integrate where there's some issues around that. And by default, because you have a defined API that does basically say provision, give me status, you can't go wrong with that. It's an API basically. What you do with the results and how you manage that is a separate story. But that software exists. Any hardware provider, including the big guys, if the Nokias and the Adtrans of that world want to do it as well as the Zycels and the Kinectics and the smaller guys, they can. It solves interoperability. The problem with interoperability is not in the protocol. It's not in the data model. It's how you use those. So if there's a sequence of events that you need to follow to make it come up to speed, to start up, to shut down, and some vendors will implement that slightly different, that's where the interoperability comes up. You don't get that issue with the Volta system, basically.
So the Volta system, are there any examples of where it's being used, if you can name
them? Yeah, absolutely.
What sort of results do you see?
So historically, AT&T is one of the biggest suppliers in the world, kind of kicked off this world, and Deutsche Telekom is a reference supplier, a reference service provider for this. Turk Telekom also uses that. They're in different worlds. We all use the same OLT implementation, the same software for the implementation. How you manage it, different provider platforms who are members of the Linux Foundation Broadband, but they can simply interwork. Now, just to give you an example, OLT interoperability is a non-issue. From months to do interoperability to bring on board a new OLT, you're talking 1 to 2 weeks. ONTs, even easier, because there's a very defined protocol with a system called OpenOMCI that Volta supports and implements. And to have a footprint of 50 to 100 ONTs that simply interoperate is de facto. So that happens today. Those are the two bigger deployments. There are also some other deployments so that's kind of a centralized deployment of Volta as a solution. There's a couple of other deployments. Jio in India has a very large footprint, and Telefonica in Brazil, a company called Vivo, also has that deployment. And we're seeing that there's more and more providers that want to embrace that because it breaks vendor lock.
And which is fantastic. Thank you for that. So those more and more people that you're seeing getting interested in this, what's your advice to them? How do they get started? What's the first thing they need to be thinking about?
So obviously do your research, right? And see where you are in your life cycle. If you've already had some implementations and you're doing well, you'd think twice about changing. The problem is not in the protocol. The problem is not in the data model. The problem is in the APIs itself. If you want to, for example, see Deutsche Telekom or Telekom as a supplier, as a service provider, a customer, this would fit right in because your product would automatically fit into that environment. So that's the first thing. Do your research and see what it's fit for purpose. It's open source, so the latest released version is available. You can download. You can join Linux Foundation Broadband. So that will be the next step. So now you've convinced yourself that this is for you. You're a new hardware provider. Your software isn't quite doing what you want it to do. We can help. Have a look at us and get in contact with me, or go to the Linux Foundation Broadband, and there will be a membership form. There will be a business value and membership levels, and get a conversation going. And then we can talk about how does it fit for you, for a service provider, for a vendor, for a systems integrator. There's different markets. So depending on who you are, what you're trying to achieve, there are different assets that you can use from the Linux Foundation Broadband.
Okay. And you have a close relationship with the Broadband Forum. You were on a stage here earlier today with them talking at the event behind us. So
Absolutely. So my background is from British Telecom and also OpenReach from a researching point of view. So I have the service provider badge, if you like. And now I'm in the supplier world. So I totally understand where you will need to be in terms of procurement and audit trails and compliance. And what the Broadband Forum does is Broadband Forum is some very rigid, some very detailed, very specific technical reports that most, if not all, of the tier one suppliers in the world, the Vodafones, the Deutsche Telecoms, the Telefonicas, they all use that for compliance. So I want to buy from you, please provide the compliance against that. Open source is a different beast. Open source comes from a different world. We've implemented this. And sometimes whilst you have the API, you don't necessarily have the carrier gate requirements.
Yeah.
And the joining of the dots between the two is massive. So I also sit on the board of directors for the Broadband Forum. Helps me to leverage the relationship, the collaboration, and we're doing well. I'm pleased to say that actually both parties are embracing what one can give to the other. So it's a really good story.
Great. Good. Well, thank you for telling the story. It's really good to hear all of that. And if people are listening, we encourage everyone to go and find the LF Broadband website or to get in touch.
Thank you. Pleasure.